Committee. It's 3:30 and we have before us witnesses from the Department of Public Works and Government Services, and we are doing the study on the freeze on departmental budgets. We have Mr. Andrew Trosh, the Associate Deputy Minister, Mr. Alex Lacroni, sorry, I better watch what your names, Madame Lorenzato and Madame Weber. Do you have any opening remarks, Mr. Trosh? Okay.
Yes, I do. Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon. My name is Andrew Trosh. I'm the Associate Deputy Minister at Public Works and Government Services Canada. With me are Alex Lacroni, the Chief Financial Officer, Diane Lorenzato, the Assistant Deputy Minister of Human Resources, Carolyn Weber, Assistant Deputy Minister of Corporate Services Policy and Communications Branch. We're happy to be back before the committee following our department's last appearance for main estimates a few weeks ago. I'd like to note as well that PWGSC tabled its report on plans and priorities on March 25th. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to talk about the role Public Works and Government Services Canada plays in supporting the government's approach to returning its budget to balance as outlined in Budget 2010. Now, PWGSC is a large and a complex department. It plays an integral role in the daily operations of the Government of Canada. Our vision is to excel in government operations, and our strategic outcomes are to deliver high-quality services and programs that meet the needs of federal organizations and ensure sound stewardship on behalf of Canadians.
As a common service provider for the Government of Canada, PWGSC acts as the government's principal real property manager, central purchasing agent, banker and accountant, as well as providing services in payroll, pensions, information technology, and translation, among others. Under the government's Economic Action Plan, we received more than $400 million over 2 years to accelerate our plans to repair and restore federal buildings and bridges and enhance the accessibility of buildings where federal services are provided. PWGSC is also providing support in areas such as procurement to other government departments and agencies that are delivering on their own commitments under the Economic Action Plan over 2 years.
Changes in recent years, and we believe we're well positioned to absorb the impact of the freeze. A few years ago, we embarked on an ambitious program of renewal and transformation, seeking efficiencies and adopting common business practices, particularly in the areas of acquisitions, real property, and information technology. Having also strengthened our financial planning, we promote strict discipline in budget management to ensure adherence to sound, standardized financial principles. As well, we have a forward-looking integrated human resources plan with numerous strategies to ensure a solid workforce and a healthy workplace. In keeping with our culture of continuous improvement, PWGSC is currently looking at options to generate the targeted savings of 5% over 3 years under the current round of strategic reviews. PWGSC was highly rated in its most recent assessment under the Treasury Board Secretariat's comprehensive measure of departmental performance, the Management Accountability Framework. PWGSC has a robust governance structure to monitor our functions and support strategic decision-making at senior levels. To deliver on our mandate, PWGSC will spend a gross $6.3 billion this fiscal year. Contrairement à la plupart des autres ministères, TPS GC offre des services.
Unlike most other departments, PWGSP provides both mandatory services and optional services to other government departments and agencies. For optional services, we operate on a user pay system and thus depend on revenue primarily from our client government departments to cover 56% of our expenditures, or $3.5 billion. Our funding by Parliament is $2.8 billion, or $6.3 billion of gross expenditures, less $3.5 billion of revenues. Examples of optional services include auditing, consulting, and translation services to departments, and telecommunications and informatics services.
On March 4th primarily targets operational budgets while allowing collective agreements to be funded within those levels. We estimate the impact on our operating budget of $3.4 billion to be $8.7 million in 2010-11, which is less than 1% of these funds. In response, we're planning to exercise tighter control of expenditures, increased rigor in all of our financial management, mitigate potential risks to revenue by closing agreements earlier in the fiscal year, continue to carefully manage spending on travel, hospitality, and conferences as prescribed by Budget 2009, and decrease demand in certain areas such as professional services. These measures are consistent with our commitment to ongoing improvement in every area of our business. Madam Chair, in addition to a copy of my opening remarks, dans les deux langues, je suis heureux de...
Both languages. I am pleased to provide you with a one-page overview
and our level of funding. This concludes my prepared statements, and Madam Chair, we are here for your questions.
Thank you very much, and we will go with the first round. Ms. Hall-Findlay for 8 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here with us this afternoon. I note that the budget for public works over the last 5 or 6 years, up until this year, had remained pretty consistent, a little bit up, a little bit down. And then all of a sudden, we see a jump from last year of almost 20%. Two questions. Well, actually, there are several questions from that. One is, where exactly what exactly does that cover, and why? And then I would like to go further into what does that mean in terms of the announced freeze and indeed the additional strategic review for reduction. So the first one is, why is there such a significant increase this year? And then what will, let's go from there and then hopefully be able to ask more on that.
Thank you for the question. 2000, I'll give you our overall main estimates figures for 5 years, beginning in 2006-07.
No, I've already seen all of those numbers, and unless, I mean, everything I've seen has shown a fairly consistent number, but my question is focused on the significant increase from last year to these mains that we're dealing with now.
Very well. So main over main 2009-10 was $2,387,000,000, going to $2,847,000,000 this year. That's a significant increase. The largest part of that increase would be explained by our department's participation in the government's economic action plan, in particular the accelerated infrastructure program, where we have committed an additional over $400 million over the 2 fiscal years, the one that just closed and the one that we're just entering. In addition, our department has other project funding. A good example of that would be the funding moving through our department in relation to the G8 and G20 summits. Over the 5 years, you will find an increase. In the earlier years, you'll find some decline in our main expenditures, largely related to the economies associated with the way forward, which were in the real property side. And in the last couple of years, indeed, as a result of the Economic Action Plan, you'll see growth.
So thank you for that. So then my next question does relate specifically to the freeze and then the strategic review. Both Economic Action Plan expenditures are temporary in nature, as well as, I'm hoping, G8, G20. There's lots of opportunity to go down there, but we're hoping that, well, how bad as it is, it's going to be temporary. In both of those cases, then, can you tell me what the number will be that will actually be frozen? I'd like to have a commitment that the freeze will, in fact, be on the numbers that would take out Economic Action Plan numbers and G820 numbers, which, as you've just said, are significant increases. So, what's the number that will actually be frozen?
The number that would be frozen is our regular operating budget. That translates in 2010 and 11 to $8.7 million. It's less than 1%. It excludes Budget 2010 actions. In other words, funding for G8 and G20 is excluded from that, as is our participation in the government's Economic Action Plan.
But so maybe I'm a bit confused, because I'm looking at main estimate numbers here of total expenditure. This is after revenues taken out. Last year was $2 billion for, and then that we have $2.8 billion. That's not the part that is being frozen. You're saying none of the accommodation real property assets management piece, none of that is actually part of this freezing?
It's our operating expenditures which are being frozen. There would be operating expenditures in the real property part of our department, but for example, there you would also find a lot of capital votes. They're not affected.
Okay, thank you. If it's all right, I'm sharing my time with my colleagues.
Okay. Go ahead.
First of all, thank you very much for being here today. We appreciate your time and your attention to the details. One area that did not receive additional funding that I can see year over year, and in fact probably saw a reduction of $32 million, was the Information Technology Infrastructure Services. Now, we do know that the Auditor General has had comment on this very important issue, saying that while you've made some steps to manage the risks related to aging IT systems, much work remains to be done. Can you just talk about, because the Auditor General has identified this as an area of concern, can you explain why funding for the IT infrastructure services has been, looks like it's been cut, and perhaps comment on whether where you see this going and how you're going to address this very serious issue when indeed you're looking at a freeze and a further 5%.
Certainly. Thank you for the question. IT is an important part of our department, and indeed we have been before a parliamentary committee in the recent past on the issue of aging IT infrastructure. A lot of IT funding is project-related, and project-related funding has its own lifeline. The two major IT projects that we have underway within the department right now are the transformation of pension administration and the transformation of pay initiative. These are both major undertakings. One initiative involves a $246 million investment by the government. That's the pension side. On the pay side, an investment of $298 million. Now, that will take place over many years, and in one instance, we're at the very start of that as well. Across the department, we are now putting together an investment plan in response to the Auditor General's report, so that we know we can provide the assurance that we're putting our investment on the priorities of the department. And we will be ensuring then that we have a departmental-wide plan, which is what the Auditor General's report was attesting to.
How much time do I have remaining?
And a half.
Okay, I have two final questions. That's why I'm asking for my time. The next question has to do with, if you can just espouse generally about this. You've had an increase in what my colleague has indicated, that you're leveling off. You're not putting in the increases that you've had in terms of the budget freeze. So, A, you've got a budget freeze. Secondly, you've talked about a few years ago you did this whole ambitious program of renewal and transformation and seeking efficiencies, and now you're about to embark on another plan to look at another 5%. What services or indeed human resources are you going to have to target in order to achieve these savings that are required now?
Well, in relation to the operating budget freeze, which is the subject of our call here today, given the size of our budget, which I described in my opening remarks, we believe we can manage the freeze by administrative measures, and I outlined some of those in my opening remarks. With respect to the strategic review process, we are one of several departments where we will be looking at across all of our programs in a comprehensive way. We'll be looking to eliminate duplication, waste, programs which are low performing. Our proposals will be presented to our minister. She in turn takes them to Treasury Board, and in due course the decisions of the government would be announced and would constitute part of the budget in 2011.
Thank you. We now go to Monsieur Nadeau for 8 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Well, we all know that there has been a pay increase and of 1.5%, and on the other hand, departments were not given additional money to fund those increases, so budgets were kept at the same level as last year. What concerns me is the extra workload this will represent for public servants and government workers at every level. We all know that public servants are retiring because they can collect their pensions, and government is a huge machine. There's also a degree of natural attrition. People will transfer into other jobs within government, or they'll find something in the private sector. So how are you going to manage these changes in your staff levels without increasing the workload of your employees, and knowing that you might not necessarily have enough people to fill the positions which have been vacated?
Question. It's obviously a question of working smarter. I think it's a very intelligent question. We certainly grapple with increased demands for services. Workload is an issue. We do have attrition rates. We will continue to have retirements. So the only way that you can match the demand for work and some of the budget constraints we will manage is by re-engineering our business processes and by getting more economies and efficiencies out of the tax dollars that we have now. Obviously, new technologies give us possibilities that we did not have in the past. And so, like in the private sector, we're always in the search for economies and efficiencies in the way that we organize ourselves internally. One example to illustrate this point would be substituting telepresence for meetings. Much more economical by harvesting modern technology. We can have a conference using teleconference instead of all the costs involved in travel.
Parce que je comprends votre point de vue.
Yes, I understand what you're saying, and I understand the point of view you're presenting us with the idea of working smarter, but nevertheless there are limits to that concept. You can stretch the elastic only so far, and then it snaps. So it seems that we're only applying a Band-Aid to this problem and not finding a more permanent solution. So I myself am a former teacher, and before I became a member of Parliament, we also had trouble recruiting new teachers. Now I'm changing sectors a little. But there was huge competition, and of course you have to compete against other levels of government as well as with the private sector.
Trouver des sous, c'est les sous-contractants.
And one solution which people have been referring to is to hire consultants. And I was wondering whether the public service is going to hire consultants, that is, people who are not permanent public servants, to fill positions, and which will end us costing more because we were not able to find permanent people to fill those vacated positions.
An excellent question. This question is often raised whether in some way the operating budget freeze would disincent regular staffing and rather, as a consequence, foster greater use of outside consultants. It's important to be alert to the fact that just as public service salaries are part of our operating budget, so would be the costs of outside consultants. So insofar as there would be $8.7 million less in the pot for public works for operating purposes, it's certainly less money for engaging consultants. And in fact, that's one of the areas where we plan to be more diligent in the coming years, is our use of consultants. Insofar as what the numbers show, our ability to recruit, which is at the heart of your question, sir, in the year that just closed, we've brought in over 1,000 people into our department, and 1,000 people the year before that, and the year before that, and the year before that. So we're very competitive. We're able to recruit to our department, and we can do that at the same time as we can improve our demographics and close the gap, whether it's with respect to women, persons with disabilities, Aboriginal Canadians, and visible minorities. We've met 3 of those 4 targets, and on the 4th one, we're quite close there as well.
Parce que je me souviens, à un moment donné, lorsque Monsieur...
I remember at one point when Mr. Fortier was the minister responsible for public works and Ms. Lorenzato was at that particular meeting, we were discussing the management of pay services, and it was an issue which the committee took particular interest in because in fact, there had been delays and problems and they weren't getting paid on time. At the time, we had also met with union representatives, and again, at the time, the person who managed pay services was good at his or her job, but was earning less than other people in the public service doing the same job. So as soon as that person was trained, after 2 or 3 years, they went elsewhere. You have just told us that you're very competitive. Did you change the pay scales in this very specialized area within this big machinery of government? So again, did you change the pay scales for pay analysts and pension managers, pension analysts? You have 1 minute left, Mr. Nadeau. So again, how were you able to find solutions to the problem of that day? Thank you very much. I would ask my colleague to answer the question. Thank you, Mr. Nadeau. Recruiting people to work in pay at the time was a real challenge because the department did not offer good conditions. What we did is we created a development program so that people recruited in pay services at a junior level, and then we put them through this development program which takes them up 2 pay levels. This development program is structured with coaches and mentors, in-class training and on-the-ground training. Therefore, employees do not have to find a promotion elsewhere. They can move up the ladder within their own department. We also did something else as far as our human resources community is concerned. We created a roadmap for our pay employees, and this roadmap shows our employees that there's a future for them at a higher level within the department. We also applied the same principle in other sectors within the department, that is, translation services, human resources, finance, within our economic sector, procurement and the management of real estate. And so the department is a really interesting place for people to work because they can move up the ladder within public works. And this is how we managed to address that issue, and we were able to attract the people we need.
Mr. Walkington.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente. Merci aux témoins d'être présents.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here this afternoon. Could you please tell us which part the freeze in your operating budget has affected the most?
Again, it will be restricted to the operational part of our budget, which, again, the priorities that you would have seen in budget 2010 would not be affected. Our capital budget would not be affected. Our program allotments, if you like, would not be affected. So it will be our administrative side or our operational funds. We also have a freeze that's specifically related to our travel and to our hospitality. So those are good examples of the kinds of things that are affected by the department. All of our operating money, that's the kind of thing where we will need to find $8.7 million in savings.
Quelles sont les stratégies mises en place pour garantir?
What strategies have you put in place to guarantee that the reductions you make will be strategic and reasonable?
Here at my right, his principal preoccupation is ensuring that our budget is in the black, is balanced. At the start of the year, we have our plans. We have our plans to deal with any financial pressures. Included in those plans will be strategies to manage our operating budget freeze. And then on a regular basis, we examine our budget situation, all of our envelopes, and against the forecast. And that's led very much by the CFO and his whole work, but the whole management team. In our performance accords, financial management is a critical aspect of how we rank our senior managers. We expect them to be on top of the expenditures of their branches, and we expect them to ensure that they're managing to the budget and that they're forecasting as well as they can.
Quelles sont les expériences des dernières?
And the last economic decisions which were taken, how can they help you better manage your current budgetary envelopes?
Tim?
Nous avons vécu d'autres récessions.
In the past, there have been other recessions and other budget freezes. Did we learn lessons back then to develop a strategy to deal with the current situation?
Sir, I have the good fortune of having been a civil servant through the recession of 1980-81, 1990-91, the program review experience of the mid-90s and now. And certainly, while as a government we face some economic and some fiscal challenges as we go through this recession into recovery, this is nothing like the challenge of the mid-1990s. We enter it in a situation, a relatively better off situation in terms of our debt and deficit load. And we're coming out of it with a sterling first quarter this year, 6.1% annualized growth. So the measures will not need to be as onerous as we experienced over a decade ago. The operating budget freeze as well is a freeze that, as a departmental manager, we welcome because it leaves a great deal of latitude to departments to allocate this according to their own needs and priorities. If in the mid-90s we had quite a severe and dramatic action on the human resource side, thousands of civil service jobs were eliminated, freezes were, there was as well a staffing freeze of various incarnations, and these left a legacy that some have referred to as a lost decade in a management gap that we've never really been able to fully regain. So we're more fortunate this time. The economic and fiscal environment is more fortuitous. And secondly, this measure of an operating freeze allocates more flexibility and helps us mitigate the human resource aspects of it relative to either a staffing freeze or a salary reduction, which would obviously make recruitment either difficult or impossible.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do thank you, witnesses, for being here this afternoon. We appreciate your testimony this far. I just wanted to follow up in terms of you talked about the decade in which there was, I guess, minimal hiring, therefore it caused a gap in terms of the escalation of that grouping that would have otherwise been hired at that point when it came to the groups that would have gone into the management roles. You spoke about demographics a little bit. You mentioned female components. You talked about visible minorities, people with disabilities. I'm wondering about age, the demographic of age. How is it right now within your department? Do you have any concerns as it relates to impending retirements? And are you, I guess the question is, are you as lopsided as the private sector is right now?
I have serious concerns with age, I tell you. But I think you're asking for my view of the department.
Yes, that's right.
Do I have the average age figure here? Let me search.
At the bottom of your page 1.
Okay, I'm just searching. Yeah, I have an age distribution here, sir, and I'm trying to find a pithy way to summarize it. Here's one way of looking at it. The largest percentage falls in the 50 to 54 age band. That's 20% of our employees. And that is followed by the 45 to 49 age band, 16%. So that indicates the aging of our demographic. You do see the results of our recruitment, though. You see at the bottom end, you see 10% of our population under 30. So you can see the inflow, and you can see people that look like me across the department as well. We have between 500 and 600 persons retiring every year, and that's on a stock of a department that's between 14 and 15,000. So that gives you a sense. That demographic is worrisome, and it's probably the major preoccupation of our human resource assistant deputy minister. It's not unlike other departments, and it's not unlike large sectors of the private sector. And one of the things we share in common when we get together with private sector leaders is we share the same human resource challenges, and aging is the principal concern.
Well, I appreciate that, and I guess I was hoping you had a different answer, but it sounds like you're in line with the rest of the world, and so we'll all look to that plan. If you come up with the answer to the plan, let us know, because we have other departments that we'd like to share that information with. Thank you.
Thank you, and we go to Monsieur Allen for 8 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all for being here. The demographics were interesting. The age piece, specifically the age piece that you talked about, is worrisome from a couple of components. Clearly, one is the knowledge base that potentially one loses if indeed the number escalates, because when folks are 50 to 54, at 20% of your workforce, you're looking at losing 1/5 potentially in a very short span of time, based on pension requirements of 55, as some folks see it, or 60. So I guess one of the questions around your HR strategy is, how do you work your knowledge folders as to how you intend to make sure that you have that knowledge? The other piece being, and since you've clearly looked at this quite rigorously, an HR strategy that no doubt, because of the freeze in your operational budget, where you aren't, doesn't matter if you hire a consultant for $1 less, you really have got $1 less to start with. So that being the case, do you have a strategy in place that says these are the bare bones that I need to replace based on the numbers that go out the door? And do you have any specifics to that? Because I'm sure by the sounds of what I've heard in the first half hour, 40 minutes, you've been quite specific about this is an all-encompassing thought process when it comes to an HR strategy.
Thank you. If I may, I'll try to answer your question, sir, and Deanne, please supplement me with your more expert knowledge. Let me just start with the basic math. We have been, for a while now, fixated on the renewal of the public service, and central to this has been recruitment of the next generation of leaders, and then progressively training and development of these new recruits. So in round numbers, I mentioned that the wave of retirement, we're looking at 500 to 600 persons a year. And if you recall the recruitment numbers I was citing, and this was only post-secondary recruitment, we're talking, I think, about 1,000 people each year over the last 3 years alone. So you can see the augmentation of our human resource at the base. Now, when people come into the department, given these demographics, it means that we need to be upping our game on training and development, and we're doing that. On coaching and career development and mentoring, and we're doing that. On succession planning for our vital positions, and we're doing that. We're doing a number of other things, but those are obviously the fundamentals of a human resource strategy, and we are doing much more in those areas than we would have 1, 2, 3 years ago. And those will continue. Indeed, I expect we will probably be doing more of those in the coming year, notwithstanding the freeze. Deanne?
Actually, I could add that we've just launched a new initiative on knowledge transfer, and that is to address that specific issue. We are concerned that there's some position that we call critical because the knowledge that comes with the position is something that you've gained over a series of years. And we've done a pilot project in one of our region, in the Quebec region, and in one of our major branch, the real property, to test our tools to transfer that knowledge. So what we want to do is to institutionalize the way we transfer the knowledge that are specific to those positions. Regarding the critical mass that we need as a department to deliver on our mandate, we've asked each of our ADMs to do their strategic staffing plan. And as part of the plan, they have to identify what are the critical positions in their organization in order to deliver on their mandate. And that combined with the knowledge transfer, the succession planning, and the recruitment strategy, we should be in a position to fulfill our requirement. We also have a departmental learning policy that clearly states that every employee needs to have a learning plan, and that we have a minimum of 3 days of learning per employee. Of course, that will fluctuate depending on where you are on your maturity growth vis-a-vis your position. But our investment in training has been constant year after year. So we've been addressing it from different angles.
It certainly sounds that you're doing a lot of work at HR. I didn't get a number of what that critical mass is, but I need to move on to something else. Because one of the items in your budget clearly talks about there's money that's comes from the tax base, and then there's others that comes from a revenue base. So part of that obviously is we have heard things about there's assets out there that perhaps may not stay on the asset side, they may be sold, or maybe moved on or done other things with. So if indeed you do get rid of assets in the sense of whatever those happen to be, how will you account for the money that you receive for the asset, and what can it be used for within your department, if anything at all, and have you identified any of those assets as to you may want to actually be disposing of?
Well, insofar as we have capital assets, then they're in relation to our capital budget. And again, the capital budget is not affected by the operating fees. There are well-defined policies and procedures for the disposal of Crown assets. And I'm not an expert in this vocation, but when an asset is declared that the department no longer, or the custodian no longer has a need for it, there's a policy to be followed where we ensure that it's indeed surplus to the Government of Canada, that there is no requirement for it. Then, presuming that it is not a contaminated site or not subject of an Aboriginal claim, it may be disposed of and disposed of to ensure a value for the Crown, in other words, at market rates. That's a general review of what happens. We do indeed, from time to time, have properties which are asset, and they can be disposed of. Sometimes they're disposed of ourselves, and sometimes by the Canada Lands Corporation that has a mandate here. The important thing to note is that where there are revenues or proceeds from the sale of a Crown asset, they do not accrue to the custodian department. They accrue to the Consolidated Revenue Fund.
And a very brief question, Mr. Allen. You've got 30 seconds.
Thank you. Have you identified any surplus assets?
At any particular time, there are probably assets in our inventory that would be surplus to our requirements.
Thank you. We go to the last round. 5 minutes, Ms. Hall-Finlay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I just have one very simple question, and then if we can share my time with my colleague. Mr. Toish, you'll just have to bear with me. But I heard a number of numbers, and I heard a number of numbers about savings and what was actually being frozen or not. And I've remained just a little bit confused. I see a lot of line items in the description of the comparison of 09-10 to 010-11 main estimates. What is the number that will actually be subject to the freeze? So I don't want, savings. I just want to know, what is the number that's going to be frozen?
Mr. Laconi.
From our operating budget of $3.4 billion, we have a salary budget of about $1 billion. So when we apply the freeze, that leads to an amount of about $8.7 million. No,
that's not. So what I'm asking, I'm looking at a total operating expenditures here of last year of $5 billion into almost $6 billion. I'm looking at various portions that come up to operating expenditures. I'm not asking for the savings. I'm asking for what total is going to be frozen.
Well, the total that's
when we hear that the government is advertising and bragging about departmental freezes, I'm looking at very big numbers here that have increased by almost 20%. All I'm trying to get at is, what is the departmental number that will actually be frozen, and so that we can compare apples to apples when, in fact, we want to hold the government to account on the actual freezing. So what's the one number? What's the number that's going to be frozen?
I think I will provide you with an explanation than the number. On $3.4 billion of operating budget, there is a salary envelope of about $1 billion, $1.80 billion. When we account, and this is again an estimate because the amount has not been confirmed yet to us officially, so give and take, we're looking at a freeze of about $8.7 million. That's the amount to be frozen. So out of a
total departmental budget of, in terms of operating expenditures that I'm looking at, that's now $6 billion, almost $6 billion, the only portion that's actually going to be frozen is $8.7 million?
Okay, I don't think the operating budget is of $6.3 billion.
Well, I'm looking at total operating expenditures. If I'm missing something, I'm more than happy to have you explain it to me. I'm just looking for a number.
Okay. The $6.3 billion is various components. As Mr. Trush explained, the special allotments that are for non-discretionary expenditures are excluded from the freeze. For instance, all the money for the Economic Action Plan.
I hate to be blunt, and I understand that. So what I'm trying to get out of this is take out the discretionary amounts, what is the number that will be frozen so that I can say, we were told that this department's budget was going to be frozen. I just want to be able to compare. What is the number? And if it's only 8.7 million, that's not a hell of, pardon my language, that's not an awful lot in the grand scheme of the advertisement that somehow government departments are being frozen, because that ends up being a very small portion of, in fact, the departmental spending.
Well, I have to go back to the basics of the budget. A big chunk of our budget is for non-discretionary expenditures. And the government decision is that those non-discretionary expenditures to be excluded from the freeze. In addition to that, we have other expenditures that are revenue dependent. So when you make all those adjustments, and on a salary of about $1 billion, more or less the freeze, it's an estimate again until it is confirmed, it's $8.7 million for 10-11.
Thank you.
I'll sure. That very briefly by saying that by its very title, the operating budget freeze is meant to eliminate growth in the operating expenses of a department. Insofar as the government is looking to harvest savings from programs, that process would be strategic review, and that's the process that will unfold for our department over the coming year.
Thank you very much, and I thank you for being here. I will suspend the committee for 30 seconds while we change our witnesses. Thank you. Yeah. Yes, Mr.
I'd like to express some concern on behalf of Le Bloc and on behalf of the NDP and on behalf of the Conservatives. I really appreciate that the Liberals have great quality of questions, and I think that's really excellent, and I think the tenor of the questions are useful. What I'm appealing to the chair is for a sense of fairness, and insofar as I know I had a series of questions that I was slated to be the next Conservative speaker, and it would have been great if all of us had had a second round. And I would appeal to you that if we do not all have a second round as per our flow through, that no one gets a second round. So we find some way to do that in the spirit of fairness, because it seems to me that the bloc, I think, would have had other questions to ask our guests. I think the NDP and certainly we would have had that as well. So we need to find a way, Madam Chair, if I might through you, to make it fair to all concerned. So I appeal to your sense of fairness.
It was a committee rule that was established, and if committee is agreeable to say no second round, because we have tight 45 minutes, and if it's agreed by the committee before we start the next, we're starting this one anyway, we'll end at 5. What we could do is anytime we have 45 minutes only, we could stick with one round. Fair enough?
It feels fair, that's all.
Thank you. We have before us from the Information Commissioner, Madame Suzanne Legault, who is the interim. You're still the interim commissioner?
I'm still interim, yes.
Till somebody ordains the final commission. And Madame Laila Michaud, the interim assistant information commissioner. And I understand you have some opening remarks. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
The floor is yours.
Madame la Présidente.
Madam Chair, thank you very much for the opportunity to present today the perspective of the Office of the Information Commissioner of Canada as part of the committee's study of the impact of the budget freeze on federal institutions' budgets. I come before you today with two perspectives. One, as the head of the Office of the Information Commissioner. Second, as the Ombudsman of the Access to Information regime in Canada. My remarks this afternoon, Madam Chair, will outline both perspectives. First, I would like to state that as a steward of public funds, I fully understand and fully support this exercise in fiscal restraint given the current economic situation. That said, I also believe that the budget cost containment measures has a greater impact on small institutions as the largest part of their budget is dedicated to salaries.
1983, the office has been facing an ever-increasing backlog of complaints. Investigations sometimes took years to complete, which affected the service we provided to Canadians and in some cases their right of access to information. Last year, we put into motion a very ambitious plan to maximize our efficiency and provide more timely and effective responses to our complainants by taking critical actions on investigations. Among other things, we engaged the services of investigators on contract to work on our oldest and more complex cases. We dedicated a team to our long-standing cases, and we streamlined our approach to the early resolution of straightforward complaints. Après une année de mise en œuvre, nous constatons
After 1 year of implementation, we see that these initiatives are bearing fruit. We have made a significant dent in our inventory of complaints. In fact, we closed more complaints this year than we have in the last 20 years.
On this ambitious plan is proving to be quite a challenge. Contrary to bigger institutions, we have almost no flexibility when meeting budgetary constraints, simply because there is very little fat to trim down, so to speak. Madam Chair, I am currently using every dollar appropriated to the office. My budget is extremely stretched, and we are operating at full capacity. In fact, we finished last fiscal year with a carry forward of only $180,000, which is less than 2% of our budget and less than our allowable carry forward. 2 years ago, my office received a significant increase in its budget. However, we did not get the funding we needed to support our systemic investigations function, which is responsible for our report cards and for allowing us to look at system-wide issues. This function is, in my view, absolutely crucial to the effectiveness of my investigative activities. Therefore, I had to reallocate resources internally to support it. which did have an impact on our remaining investigative cases. As a result, this year I'm starting with a deficit of $700,000. This constitutes a major pressure on my office, which could impact on our capacity to deliver on our mandate. The absorption of the wage increase only compounds this problem. In terms of this year's main estimates, our salary and operating budget is $10.8 million in 2010-2011, and our number of full-time equivalent is 106. I can report that at this time I actually have 107 people on staff. 76% of our budget is allocated to salaries, and 7% is allocated to non-discretionary operating costs, which includes office equipment and the like. Sur les 1,8 millions de dollars restants,
of the remaining $1.8 million, only 17% remains for discretionary costs. 62% of this envelope is program-related and covers the costs of the consultants working on investigations. 14% is allocated to our IM strategy, information management strategy, which we began last year, and 24% to our internal services. The salary costs we will have to absorb this year is estimated at $100,000 this year, increasing to $355,000 in 2012-2013.
This figure seems to the committee and must seem to committee members like a very small drop in a very big ocean. But for my office, this has a huge impact. And to put it in perspective, this is what it actually means. It is the equivalent of the resources required to close some 400 cases. It represents about 20% of our $1.8 million envelope for our discretionary operating costs. This makes us very vulnerable to any new pressures that may arise this year, either in the form of another court case or several court cases, or an increase in complaints, which could further erode our ability to deliver on our mandate. And to be very honest with you, Madam Chair, the last thing that I would want to find myself in a position to be is to seek additional funding to Treasury Board Secretariat to fund litigation cases where, in fact, they may be one of the institutions involved in the litigation. This fiscal year, in order to keep within our appropriations, we will have to cut costs in key areas such as training, computer replacement, and our internal audit function. But perhaps, Madam Chair, most importantly, I have a grave concern as the Ombudsman for access to information. In times of fiscal restraint, institutions have historically cut in their internal services, which includes their ATIP programs. As Ombudsman for the Access to Information regime in Canada, this does indeed cause me great concern, because inadequate funding inevitably affects this fundamental service to Canadians, and not only their service, but their fundamental democratic right. The risks include failure to meet legal requirements, declining performance, and an increase in complaints to my office. And I say this with very serious thoughts because what we have observed in our last two report cards is that under-resourced institutions use time extensions as a coping mechanism, thereby creating unnecessary delays. The drafters of the Act never intended time extensions to be a tool to manage workload. C'est pourquoi, Madame la Présidente, j'ai l'intention de continuer de surveiller le...
With this in mind, Madam Chair, I fully intend to continue to monitor the performance of federal institutions in access to information through my report cards and systemic investigations, which are key tools in assessing institutions' performance. To conclude, we have made great strides this year in reducing our inventory of cases. However, we continue to deal with an important caseload, and until such time as we reach a manageable caseload, dealing with investigations will be my #1 priority. I will continue to monitor and adjust our investigation process to reap further efficiencies so that we can reallocate resources internally.
Possibility of going back to the Treasury Board Secretariat as well as the advisory panel on the funding and oversight of officers of Parliament to ask for additional funding. Thank you, Madam Chair, and Madame Michaud, who is there with me, will be pleased to answer your questions.
Thank you very much. We have 32 minutes left. Divide by 4. It's 8 minutes per person, so 8 minutes first round. Ms. Cody.
Thank you very much to you, Madame Legault, and to you, Madame Michaud, for being here this afternoon. And outstanding reports, I must say, gives us a real idea of the impact of these budget freezes on your department. I'd also like to congratulate you for being nominated, finally, as Information Commissioner. I fully support your nomination and hope it'll come to a positive conclusion very, very shortly, and the appointment comes very quickly. I want to compliment you as well on the exemplary work that you've done over the last year. I thought that what you've been able to achieve over the last year has been outstanding, especially with the pressures that you've had on your budget. And I, for one, would love to see your budget increased. I think it's important, and I think it should go hand in hand with your appointment, to be quite frank. I think it also points out what you've been able to summarize today in your opening remarks, the impacts of this across-the-board budget freeze to you and your department, and through you and your department to Canadians. I mean, if you could close some 400 more cases a year, we'd certainly appreciate that. So I'm fully supportive of you actually receiving an increase in your particular allotment, because I think it's important to Canadians. Having said that, one of the things you did mention in your report was when historically cuts are to internal services, one of the pressures that may be found, of course, and as in you acting as an ombudsman, the whole access to information may suffer. And we're already having a lot of challenges. I reflect back on, for example, on your recent report out of time. It states that, that the Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat, in collaboration with relevant institutions and agencies, development and implement as a matter of urgency a plan to address the current shortage. And you went on to talk about the risks from inadequate funding are abundant. And I looked down your report cards that give Natural Resources Canada an F, Canadian Heritage an F, CEDA an F, and so on, and some even, for example, DFAIC got a red alert. And when you talk about that, you must be concerned about budget freeze and its impacts on those particular on these particular departments and these particular cases. Can you just talk a little bit about that, and how can we work with governments as departments to prioritize to ensure that funding is allocated to ensure that this is done?
Madam Chair, obviously one way that we are keeping track of what is happening with those departments is we are following up this year with the 13 institutions that performed below average. It's not necessarily only a question of resources. In some instances it is, and we are going to keep a very close monitoring watch on those institutions this year. At this point in time, we do not know where the cuts are going to occur within the various institutions, but we are certainly concerned because of what we observed in the last two report cards. So from our end, we are going to monitor the situation, and I know also that the Treasury Board Secretariat is also aware of the situation with those institutions, and we're going to continue to collaborate with Treasury Board Secretariat in that respect.
Thank you very much for that, for your answer. I would like to ask you, you talked about 13 institutions, and in some instances it is challenges with resources, and some instances is not. Can you care to elaborate on when it's not related to resources?
It depends on various institutions what the reasons are for less than optimal performance. What we do find is that what I call the recipe for success for the institutions that perform very well. The best example is the Department of Justice, where you have very strong leadership and commitment to access to information. You have adequate resources, both in terms of money and in terms of persons that are actually doing the job. You have very good quality information management practices. In institutions where that is not a fact, we find that it does create delays in terms of access to information simply for the retrieval of records. And so information management is the key, and ongoing training in the institution. Those are essentially the key elements of a recipe for success for access to information in any institution.
Thank you, and I share my time with my colleague.
3.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you both for being here today. And I echo echo my colleague's sentiments on the job that you've done so far under sometimes difficult circumstances, and appreciate what you do with what we both agree are not enough resources, and support that call. Who decides when something should be disclosed? When there's an access to information request, who decides what should be released and how much, if any, should be kept back or redacted?
Well, the decision on disclosure or non-disclosure, Madam Chair, is basically and should always be based on the legislation itself. I mean, the legislation has a presumption in favor of disclosure, and it also provides for exemptions and certain exclusions, and some of those are mandatory exemptions and exclusions, and some of them are discretionary. And in the discretionary analysis, basically the head of the institution has to decide through its delegated authority, depending on who has a delegated authority within the institution, whether or not in the exercise of their discretion the information should be disclosed.
When you say head of the institution, who do you mean by that?
Under the legislation, the head of the institution is usually the minister, or in certain agencies, it is the head of the institution. For instance, at the Information Commissioner's office, I am the head of the institution. And then each institution has various delegations of authority within the institution for the person to make the decision. For instance, in our institution, I have delegated the authority to the Assistant Commissioner and to the Director of Information Management.
So can I just extrapolate on that then? If a minister has the authority to make that decision and a member of the minister's political staff intervenes or makes a decision with regard to disclosure or not disclosure, would that then responsibility for that action reside with the minister?
I've got a point of order. Yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just find it passing strange, and I first would welcome back my colleague to the committee, but in her absence, the Liberals have gone to great lengths to say that this issue should not be discussed at this committee, but rather at ethics, and that I would just encourage maybe, Madam Chair, to keep committee members on the item that we are actually responsible to look into today.
Continue on, Ms. Hall-Fenley.
So I'll just thank you, Madam Chair, and I'll just repeat the last piece of the question, that if a member of a minister's staff, political staff, intervenes in refusing to provide information or the level of censorship, given that that's a delegated authority, then can we assume that the person ultimately responsible for that action, whether it be a denial of information, would actually be the minister himself or herself?
Answer the question. Oh, okay. Yes, Mr. Walkington.
I would just implore you that there is a responsibility of the chair to keep committee members on the topic and topics that are relevant to what's been brought forward. So I just do again.
Okay.
Ask the members.
You see, this is the problem. When you say point of order, you think you've got the right to talk. You have to tell me what she has violated.
For you to rule on relevance as it relates to the questions she asked in comparison to the
but it's not a point of order you're arguing, and she has relevance because she's asking a question of the Information Commissioner. Who is the authority? She laid the foundation,
Madam Chair,
but that's fine. I'm sorry, it's not a point of order, Mr. Walkington. You're going to... Yes, and what?
The relevant topic is pursuant to the standing order that
Mr.
is
Walkington,
108.3.
it's not a point of
We are on
order.
the study of the freeze of the departmental budgets, envelopes, and government operations.
Thank you, and I rule it's not a point of order.
I will remember that when Paul Zabo comes to our committee and Mr. Lee comes to our committee as well.
It's not a point of order. Go ahead, continue on. Ms. Hall-Fenley. Oh, sorry, you had a question. Answer.
Madam Chair.
Yes.
I am not an expert in terms of ministerial responsibility. I do understand, though, that given the way that the Access to Information Act is drafted and the fact that it does give the responsibility as the head of the institution in most departments to the minister, that the minister is the person responsible under the legislation. For instance, I'll make 2 points. For instance, when I issue what we call a Section 37 letter under the legislation. And this is something I instituted this year, which is the last step in my investigative function where I want to have a final decision from the institution. I am addressing those letters to the ministers, and I have done so in 3 cases this year. The second point I'd like to make on that is, as you probably all know, we have now before the Supreme Court of Canada the case that is often referred to as the PM's agenda case. I suspect, Madam Chair, that that case, which is slated to be heard by the Supreme Court of Canada in October of this year, will also shed some light on the issue of ministerial responsibility as it is in respect to the administration of the Access to Information Act.
I'll go to Monsieur Nadeau for 8 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Bonjour, Mesdames.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good afternoon to our witnesses. You are in a very delicate situation because nobody really can anticipate the number of complaints you will receive in any given year. There may be more or less, but each complaint has to be investigated on its own merits. So, in fact, you are working in quicksand, if I can put it that way. And therefore, you need sufficient resources to ensure that your office can fulfill its mandate based on all requests made to your office. There are supplementary estimates. They are adopted throughout the year. And we also have these supplementary B estimates. Again, I don't want to put you on the hot seat. You said that Treasury Board was aware of the situation you are facing within your office and the budget constraints you have to deal with. If for very noble reasons you can plead your case for more funding, do you think that Treasury Board will be open to such a request, or do you think that you will not be met with an open mind? Well, Madam Chair, I have to say that in the last 2 years, and given the creation of the advisory panel on the funding and oversight of officers of Parliament, the process for reviewing requests for additional funding has been very well managed, and it works well. Madam Chair, when we did appear before Treasury Board to request additional funding, which we did get, we conducted an analysis of the history of complaints we have received over the years, and we based our request for funding on this historical analysis. As you know, in 2006 to 2007, 2008, we received a significant increase in the number of complaints following the adoption of the Accountability Act. However, this year we received about 1,600 complaints, which is markedly less than we have received in the past. So we will see how that will unfold. But where we have a problem now is that we still have a backlog of 2,000 cases, and this is where the problem lies. So it is the combination of the backlog and our systemic investigations which make us more vulnerable. That being said, I promised to myself that before I returned before Treasury Board again, I would review in detail our operations to find any savings I can make, and I will think about that and work on that this summer. Following that exercise, if necessary, I will appear before Treasury Board again. I have to do this in-depth analysis first to see where any efficiencies can be delivered in fulfilling our mandate before I ask for more money. As I said in my statement, I respect and understand the fact that we are in difficult economic times, so I certainly am going to do my best first and look at every opportunity to find efficiencies before requesting additional funding. You said you have about 116 full-time equivalents working for you. we were talking about this issue with Public Works, which of course is a completely different beast and which is much bigger, but the principle of the elastic applies to both of your organizations. You can stretch the elastic ever more, but at a certain point it snaps. At a certain point you cannot deliver the goods anymore and conduct all the investigations which are requested of you. So, and this, of course, can be a significant problem. I understand that other commissioners have managed their offices to the best of their abilities, but to go so far as to share office infrastructure and photocopies and coffee machines with them, well, that's going in a completely different direction. I'm just wondering whether there are other organizations which have found savings and whether you can apply the model those organizations have adopted to your own. You said that you want to do a thorough analysis before asking for more money. Have other offices of Parliament done the same thing? Well, Madam Chair, I have to say that my research does not include looking at how other organizations, whether here in Canada or abroad, how they operate or have found efficiencies. And sometimes it's difficult to make these comparisons because international organizations operate differently. I think it makes more sense to compare my office with other organizations within Canada. I think it might be interesting to see how other jurisdictions fulfill their mandate and whether it would be interesting to compare the jurisdictions who have the ability to order documents and to have a mandatory system compared to those who don't. This type of comparison hasn't been done yet, but it might be interesting to study them here in Canada. Thank you. I certainly hope that many people are going to read the transcripts of this meeting because you have many good ideas. I believe you met with Mr. Marleau at a certain point to discuss these matters, and the issue of complaints came up. That is, many complaints made by the same person, and whether some of the complaints may have been frivolous. Have you found that once a complaint has been deemed serious, do the same people work on the same files in the interest of efficiency? Well, Madam Chair, one of the first things I did last summer when I became acting commissioner is that I asked the commissioner who's not here this afternoon, or rather the assistant commissioner, one of the first things I asked of her was to establish a full inventory of our cases. We worked with certain institutions. Some of these institutions rather always have the same people who make complaints, and so we try to create links between different kinds of complaints. We established relationships with the people who file these complaints so we could better understand where they were coming from and how their organizations operated.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to thank our guests for coming today. Madame Legault, if I may say, I appreciate your presentation. We haven't heard from Ms. Michaud yet, and perhaps we will in the course of these questions. But I sincerely appreciate the job that you've done on behalf of Canadians. I think that really matters. And I think, as my Cape Breton mom used to say, the proof in the pudding is in the eating. And so really what that means is that it's shown. I mean, it looks like when I look at the history of the cases that you have inherited, it seems to me you've inherited some backlog of 2,000 cases, if I understand correctly. And your department closed 2,215 cases. And it's rather interesting because when I look at your stats, I also see that The good news, I suppose, and I certainly perceive it as good news, is that new complaints did decrease, and you indicated that earlier, by some 350, give or take, from the prior year. So I was just trying to do some math because, frankly, I don't pretend to know your business. I'm certainly used to complaints, but I'm not used to it dealing with it at the level that you do. But I'm trying to extrapolate this out, and I'm trying to do it in relation to budgets. You did indicate, so first I want to come back to that. You did indicate that you did receive a budget increase. How much was the budget increase for? May I ask you, please, in dollars?
We received in the last 3 fiscal year, we had 2 submissions to Treasury Board Secretariat. The first one, 06-07, we received 1.4 million additional. And last year and this fiscal year, because some of the funding is kicking in, as we speak, this fiscal year, was 2.9, roughly $3 million, which was an increase in the overall budget of the OIC of 57%. So that was significant. The reasons for this increase in budget were as a result of the Federal Accountability Act. We became subject to Access to Information Act ourselves, so we had to fund that function. We also had responsibility in terms of internal audit, so we got funding for that. And we also had an increase in our internal services functions and our investigators.
So in fact, then, when I hear $1.4 million increase and then additional increase, $2.9 million additional, it's not that the government isn't trying to fund. I mean, you have a number of issues, backlog, you've indicated amongst other things. But certainly it seems from what I've heard that the government's been responsive, at least to this point. And to your credit, and I really appreciate the thoughtful way that you've approached this. You did indicate, and I'll just come back to your comment, that you didn't exclude the possibility of going to the Treasury Board should that need arise, and it may well. So you've handled this, again, I think, with great aplomb, and I salute your department for that. I want to come back to the case count, though, if I can, because I'm not an accountant like our esteemed chair is, but I would tell you that as I look at the numbers here, you inherited 2,000 cases. You closed 2,215. We had a drop in the number of new complaints by some 350. So by my account, if you're able, and by the way, and also I acknowledge that the average time to deal with the complaint, you've reduced the processing time by a third. And I need to tell you that's a credit to the people that you've brought into your team and how expeditiously they've handled things. So again, I salute you. And I appreciate that might not be a number that you can always control. I mean, how could you ever know the number of new complaints? But the good news is it's dropped somewhat significantly. So I was trying to extrapolate, at what point do you get to the stage where you could handle things based on the efficiencies that you already have? And so I'm imagining this. If you close 2,215 cases, what that meant is that you would have, from the original 2,000 backlog, you've reduced 7. That gives you 700. That gives you 1,300 backlogged cases from then. And then I add to that, if I can, the number of cases that you will get. So you've got 1,300 left, 1,650 some odd that you will deal with. So there's 3,000. Now, if you continue to deal with 2,200, that means the next year, that means you've got, instead of 1,300 backlog from the 2,000, now you've got something like 500 left or 600 left. In other words, you're doing this exactly the right way. You're reducing it down, plus you have reduced pressure if the complaints go down, which they have. So at some point I'm trying to understand, because, and again, forgive me because I don't understand the average handling time of a case and what your averages are. Could you imagine that you get to the point where your backlog is acceptable? And I would ask you what an acceptable backlog is, if that's even the right expression, and where you can manage it with resources, knowing that you're a third more efficient in terms of handling case time, and you've handled 700, so you've also handled a third more of the backlog cases. I mean, you're going to have to be making the complaint soon just so you have some to deal with, I almost wonder. And I don't mean that to be facetious, because this is serious business, but could you comment on that and help me out a little bit, please?
Madam Chair, I'll try to be clear in my answer. I think the honourable member is actually absolutely right in his analysis, in the sense that our goal and our business model is predicated upon the fact that once we have cleared our large inventory of cases, that we have a manageable carryover from year to year of between 300 and 500 cases. We are now at 2,000. That's basically what we've carried over. We started the year at 2,500, 2,513, and now we are left with 2,049, having closed 2,125. So we are catching up, and we are becoming more efficient, and that is the plan. My concern at this point is how long can it take us to actually get to that manageable caseload? And that's the concern that I have. And that's why I'm doing the analysis that I'm doing internally, because it may be that if we decide that we need additional funding, that it's only temporary funding to get us to that manageable carry forward. That's part of what I'm looking at. There are two other aspects, Madam Chair, to this question. The other one is last year we also got significant funding to renew our information technology platform. Now, for our office, this is very significant because it's our case management platform, but also our legal tracking system. This is our IT infrastructure that assists our investigation, that assists our monitoring of our performance, that assists us in identifying what's within our control and what is waiting time for institutions to respond. This case management renewal, which we are embarked on, will also, in my view, generate efficiencies. And we haven't fully realized those, so we're looking at that. And the third aspect is, because we have grown so significantly in the last year, in fact, this year is the first year that we have been fully staffed, which was the result of a very aggressive human resources strategy in September.
Time you get such a long speech to her that she had. I'm sorry. We have to go to Mr. Ellen. Mr. Ellen, 8 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm not an accountant either, Mr. Holder, but I know figures dance and dancers can figure, and so let me try to be shorter-winded, but at least talk about the numbers, because clearly, if you extrapolate the numbers out and keep everything the same as 2009-10, in other words, a caseload of 1689, it doesn't spike back up. It'll take you about 4.6 years to reduce the backlog, give or take a month. So that means that the budget increases you've asked for as additional increases to clear the backlog, you're going to have to keep asking for them. Does that seem reasonable and rational to you?
Again, Madam Chair, a very astute question by the honourable member, because that's exactly it. Our business model was predicated on a 5-year time span. The question I'm asking myself, and part of the analysis we're doing this summer, is whether that is too long a period for Canadians to have an Office of the Information Commissioner of Canada which is in a position to deal with the cases. Because at the end of the day, when we start the year with a caseload of between 300 and 500, we are going to become a lot more efficient at handling our cases because the number is going to be less. Obviously, managing 2,000 cases every year is taxing all of our investigative function, because in order to be really efficient, the more we know our cases, the better we are at dealing with them, and the less of them we have, the faster we can get to them. So that's exactly the right question to ask, and that's the question I'm asking myself. The analysis I'm doing is whether or not I can do that faster within the complement that I have or not. And I can share with this committee that my objective for this year in terms of cases closed, to the great damn of my employees, is 2,400, which is where I'd like to be at. But I'm getting some serious concerns from my staff at this point.
But it also begs the question, because, I mean, and I agree with you about the numbers, by the way, but the dilemma is assuming 1689, give or take one or two, call it 1690. The dilemma is you're about 400 cases, new cases initiated this year versus last. Well, the year before in 08-09 you had 2019. These are new cases, new complaints. In 2009-10 you had 1689, give or take almost 400. Your actual increase in closing the cases was 400. If you go back to where you were in 08-09, and it's not an unrealistic expectation, you're actually back to where you were for unclosed cases of 08-09. you actually regressed 2 years, notwithstanding all of the things, Madame Legault, that you're doing, and I give you a great deal of credit for all those decisions you're making and trying to do that with what basically, for all intents and purposes, I think is a shoestring budget, by the way. But that's just me. I used to be corporate chair in a municipality, and I probably don't know my numbers all that well, maybe. But anyways, the other thing I found interesting that you said, when I talk about shoestring budgets and the fact that we may be spinning our wheels here because we don't know how many cases you get in a year. You can't tell me absolutely what you'll get next year because none of us know. There's no crystal ball. And part of your statement was that we have observed, and I'll quote it back to you, we have observed in the last 2 report cards that under-resourced institutions use time extensions as a coping mechanism, thereby creating unnecessary delays. My fear is, and I don't know whether you share this fear, that indeed if we don't have the resources there, and our numbers do go back to what is a general level, which isn't necessarily 1689, but higher, that we will indeed get back to what I think the Canadian public sees when it comes to ATIP, which is a sense that put it in, forget about it, and somebody will knock on your door sometime in the future, and you go, oh, I did ask that question. There's my response finally. It's somewhat akin to getting the magic prize in your mailbox from that famous magazine group that obviously remain there. So I wonder if you have any comment to that.
Well, Madam Chair, there is a lot again in that question. The honourable member's question, the way I understand it, again, you're absolutely right. The risk is if we do have an increase in complaints this year, even with the increased number of cases that we close, we are going to be creating an additional backlog. And that is the huge concern that I have in dealing with the 2,000 cases that we're carrying over, as opposed to a manageable carryover. And that's why I have a clear sense of urgency in dealing with that large inventory of cases that we carry forward from year to year. So that's one aspect. In terms of the second aspect, it's true, if there is not sufficient resources, if there are not sufficient resources within institutions to actually process access to information requests, it creates delays in terms of responding to those requests, but it increases the number of complaints to my office as well, which again leads to additional delays. So I've been working very closely, and that's why the report cards have focused on delays in order to deal with those cases, because frankly, Madam Chair, I've said this many times before, where I really think we should be spending our time, not only within institutions in matters of access to information requests, but also at the Office of the Information Commissioner of Canada, is on the substantive decisions to release information to Canadians based on exemptions and exclusions, because that is really the delicate balance that needs to be struck, and that is where, in my view, my role is the most important and the most efficient to act as the arbiter in that function. We do not want to be spending our time on extensions and delays, because that is really not going to the core of what Canadians want as part of their access to information system. I hope I answered in part the member's question.
Do you have, you've got a minute more.
Right, thank
yes.
You. And I couldn't agree more about how you summed that up. It seems to me that there's a sense of, when we get into a budgetary crunch, if you will, or a sense that everyone bears the same pain or should bear the same pain. And my sense is that when it comes to a service to Canadians, when they're actually asking about the fundamental pieces of their democracy to get information, that perhaps that's one area that we shouldn't necessarily freeze or cut along with all the others. I'm not sure whether you share that view or not, but I'm simply putting it on the record. You're free to respond, obviously, if you want or not, clearly.
I think, Madam Chair, as heads of institutions that are using public money, I think we all have a responsibility to engage in fiscal restraint to the extent that it's responsible and that we're still able to carry our mandate. And that's what I think the analysis that we're going through is the responsible thing to do. And I think that it would be the responsible thing to do for any head of institution providing any service. What we want to do is to make sure that we use taxpayers' money in the most efficient way possible.
Thank you very much. So you're looking for an increase in your budget of about another $8 million. 2,400 people. So thank you very much for being here. And I'll suspend the meeting for 30 seconds, and then we can go into in camera.